Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we really try to cut through the noise, grab some fascinating sources, and give you the context, the analysis you need to be properly informed. And today we're getting into something pretty fundamental. It's about ethical challenges in, leadership, management. And we're using a lens from systems thinking, from cybernetics. We're doing a deep dive into the Minimax principle in ethical management, really exploring how this powerful idea might actually redefine responsible leadership today, what it means in the 21st century. Our sources, they're rooted in the really thoughtful work of Harish. He's a lifelong learner, just passionate about reflection, exploration. He shares some incredible insights on cybernetics, systems thinking, lean, statistics, stuff that really challenges how we tend to look at efficiency and progress. And Harish is also an active member of the CyberSyn community that's a really vibrant group focused on pushing these ideas forward. His work really asks us to look at the whole management game through a completely different lens. You called it an ethical inversion.
That's exactly it, ethical inversion. Because look, if we're honest, the language that just dominates management today, it doesn't matter if you're a startup or some huge corporation, it's all about maximization.
Right.
We talk about optimizing value, maximizing returns, scaling up, seeking maximum advantage. The whole conversation is framed around what's the biggest, best outcome we can possibly get. Now, the Minimax principle, and this comes originally from decision theory, it flips that question right on its head. It basically argues that the most rational and, in this context, the most responsible thing to do isn't chasing the maximum possible benefit. It's about strategically minimizing the worst possible outcome.
Okay, but minimizing the worst outcome sounds a bit like standard risk management, doesn't it? Downside protection. We have compliance departments, risk matrices. They tell us, don't break the law, don't lose too much money. How is Minimax really different from that?
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it's important to make the distinction. See, standard risk management often looks at things like financial exposure or regulatory breaches. It treats risk as sort of a statistic, a probability you can quantify and maybe hedge against. Minimax, when you apply it ethically to human systems, it's not a secondary checkbox. It's the primary directive. And the worst possible outcome here is very specifically defined. It's harm. Harm to people, harm to their working relationships, and crucially, catastrophic damage to that invisible infrastructure, the stuff that actually allows people to work together effectively.
Okay, so it's not just about avoiding fines, it's about avoiding human damage first.
Exactly. The difference is that Minimax really forces you, to treat harm minimization as the absolute ethical foundation. You can't just say, there's a small chance of serious harm, but look at the potential upside. No. You first have to ensure you've done everything reasonable to minimize that maximum potential catastrophe, that irreversible damage to the people involved. And only then, once that's addressed, can you start talking about maximizing profits or efficiency or whatever else.
So it fundamentally changes the first question you ask. Instead of starting with, how do we get the biggest win? You have to start with, pursuing this win. What's the absolute worst harm we could cause along the way? And how do we build in safeguards to prevent that specific harm, even if it means the win isn't quite as big?
Precisely. It's a systemic view of ethics. It's not an add-on. And, this is why that observation from Russell Ackoff is just so chillingly relevant here. It perfectly captures the kind of management failure Minimax is designed to prevent.
Ackoff.
Yeah.
Right there. The more efficient you are at doing the wrong thing, the wronger you become.
It's quite profound, isn't it? Because it just cuts straight to this paradox of optimization. Think about a really common example today. A big company decides it needs to relentlessly optimize its customer service call center. Okay, so they bring in metrics. Calls have to be handled in under, say, 2 minutes. And maybe reps' pay is even tied directly to hitting that number. And you know what? They get incredibly efficient. Call times plummet. On paper, it looks great.
Right, efficiency metrics go up. Looks like success.
But what's the wrong thing they're doing with all that efficiency? Well, they're often destroying the actual relationship with the customer. Complex problems get ignored or pushed aside because they take too long. And the employees, they're burning out under the pressure, treated like cogs. So they're maximizing one metric call time efficiency while actively, simultaneously compounding the harm. Harm to customer trust, harm to employee well-being. Their focus on maximizing that one gain completely blinds them to the quiet structural damage accumulating underneath. And that, according to the Minimax principle, is a fundamental ethical failure. They chose maximization over minimizing that relational and human harm.
Wow. Yeah, that example really lands. It happens all the time. We pour resources into making things faster, leaner. But if those same efforts are quietly chipping away at the human element, the trust, the informal ways people solve problems together, then we're just optimizing our way towards fragility, not resilience. And I think, everyone listening has probably felt this at some point. You've seen a new process, maybe a software rollout, maybe even staff cuts, hailed as a win for efficiency, for the bottom line. But you felt it eroding communication or trust, or just the ability for people to help each other out on your team. That kind of systemic erosion, that quiet loss. That's exactly what Minimax forces us to confront head on before we chase the gains.
Okay, so if we accept that harm minimization needs to be the primary ethical guide, well, how do we actually do that? We need something concrete, operational, a rule for everyday decisions. And for this, we can turn to the second wave of cybernetics, particularly the work of Heinz von Forster. He gave us a really powerful, practical definition for minimizing harm in complex systems. He proposed this ethical imperative: I shall act always so as to increase the number of choices.
Increase the number of choices, huh? That's a fascinating constraint. So the ethical value of a decision isn't measured by its immediate outcome, its profit, its flashiness, but by whether it actually expands or contracts the freedom people have to act within the system. Is that right?
That's the core idea.
But let's get practical here. How does a manager right now actually increase choices? I mean, isn't so much of modern management about reducing complexity, standardizing things, limiting choices for the sake of efficiency?
You hit the nail on the head. That is the fundamental tension. Maximization loves singularity, right? One best way, one optimized path. It pushes towards simplification. But ethical management, through von Forster's lens, demands the opposite. It demands multiplicity, optionality. So how does a manager do it? Well, they increase choice by designing redundancy into the system, by deliberately avoiding single points of failure, and this is crucial, by building processes that actually allow for human judgment, for workarounds, for bypass routes when the standard process inevitably fails or doesn't fit. For example, think about rolling out a critical new software system. The irreversible choice-destroying move is to migrate everything at once, flick the switch, and shut down the old system completely. Done.
Yeah, burn the bridges.
Exactly. An ethical action, one that preserves choice, would be maybe running both systems in parallel for a while, maintaining overlapping skills, training people on both, and having a documented, properly tested plan to roll back if the new system causes unforeseen problems. This preserves what we call reversibility.
Reversibility. Okay, that makes sense. It's about keeping options open. If you still have choices, then people, teams, they retain the ability to try different things, to experiment a little, see what happens. If the results are bad, if they're harmful, maybe the new process creates a huge bottleneck no one saw coming, or the software's buggy, well, they can pivot. They can try a different path. The system itself can kind of self-correct because that initial decision didn't lock everyone into a single, potentially disastrous path.
Precisely. It's not necessarily about being able to literally undo the past action, like hitting Control plus C. It's about ensuring you haven't trapped yourself and everyone else in a single future path, especially one that might turn out to be harmful. That capacity to change course, to adapt, that's fundamental to the system staying viable. It's the opposite of that brittle efficiency we talked about. And the real danger of those irreversible decisions, well, that's exactly where harm gets locked in. It crystallizes. When a decision is made, maybe under pressure, and it removes all alternatives. Think about cutting staff so deeply that essential cross-coverage disappears, or specializing roles so narrowly that if one person is sick, a whole process grinds to a halt. There are no other choices left. Then, when things go wrong, harm just accumulates. The system loses its ability to adapt, to find another way.
There's no slack, no buffer.
None. And think about that moment, that really human moment, when someone is forced to say, I had no choice. That phrase expresses absolute constraint, total lack of agency. When the system puts people in a position where they know they're on a path causing harm, maybe it's an impossible workload, maybe it's following destructive metrics, but they literally cannot deviate. That is the ultimate failure of this primary ethical directive. So to minimize harm fundamentally means preserving the optionality, the choices that allow people to respond, to adapt, and ultimately to recover when things inevitably go sideways.
Okay, this really shifts how you'd evaluate any new project or initiative, doesn't it? You stop asking just, is this new system 10% more efficient? Or will this cut costs? The primary question has to become, does this action increase or decrease the number of viable choices available to the people who have to live with it? If it shuts down options, if it destroys that potential for reversibility, then the risk of irreversible harm just went way up, regardless of any promised efficiency gain.
Exactly. Choice preservation becomes the bedrock. Now let's take this idea, Minimax, preserving choice, and broaden the view a bit. We need to think about the boundaries of the system. Because when we talk about preserving choices, we have to ask, whose choices are we actually talking about? And this is where the work of Werner Ulrich, specifically his critical systems heuristics, becomes absolutely essential. It adds another crucial ethical layer. Ulrich's core insight, and it's a profound one, is that every time managers or designers draw a boundary for a system, whether they're defining who's on the team, who counts as a stakeholder, or even just what metrics are considered important, that act of drawing the boundary inevitably includes some people, some factors, and just as importantly, it excludes others.
Right. And often the people who get excluded are the ones who end up dealing with the consequences, the fallout from decisions they had absolutely no say in.
That's the quiet injustice, often, of system design. You might optimize everything beautifully inside your organizational boundary. But the real cost, the harm, gets pushed outside. It gets externalized onto people who lack power or voice in your system. Maybe it's your suppliers, maybe it's temporary contractors, maybe it's the local community affected by your operations.
Yeah, the negative externalities, as the economists might call them, but Ulrich frames it ethically.
Exactly. So the ethical requirement that Ulrich derives from this is quite demanding. It says managers have a responsibility to actively, consciously try to identify who loses in the system they're designing or changing. If our core principle is minimizing the maximum potential harm, Minimax, then we simply cannot ignore the negative consequences that fall on those who were pushed outside the boundary, marginalized by the design itself. Ethics, in this view, demands that we act in ways that actually allow for the participation and, Ulrich uses this strong word, the emancipation of those who are excluded or negatively affected, giving them back some agency, some choice.
Okay, let's try to ground that. An example. Say, a big company is doing a major IT transformation. Huge project. The boundary for who's involved is drawn pretty tightly. Senior leadership, the core IT project team, maybe key people from the main business units who will benefit directly.
Right. Standard practice.
But who's typically excluded from that design process. Often it's the actual end users, the folks on the ground who have to wrestle with the system's flaws every single day. Or maybe it's the long-term maintenance team, the ones who know all the weird quirks of legacy systems being replaced, the ones who will have to keep this new thing running eventually.
Exactly. And then when the new system inevitably hits problems, because they always do, where does the harm land? It lands squarely on that maintenance team, who now have to fix something they didn't design, maybe without adequate resources or training. And it lands on those end users who are stuck using a clunky interface or dealing with bugs they could have warned about if only they'd been asked. They never had a choice. They're suffering the consequences of decisions made entirely outside their sphere of influence.
So connecting this back to Minimax, when we ask Ulrich's question, who loses? Yeah, we're actually asking a Minimax question, but applied to those at the edges. We're asking, what's the worst possible outcome for those people who are marginalized by this system boundary, and how do we minimize that harm?
Precisely. The moral responsibility isn't just about the final outcome. It lies fundamentally in how we draw the boundaries in the first place. It's about ensuring we are actively trying to protect the choices, the agency, even of those who seem peripheral to the main goal. This really moves ethical management way beyond a simple internal cost-benefit calculation.
Yeah, it forces a much wider lens. So Minimax tells us to acknowledge fragility and potential harm. Von Forster tells us the practical way is to preserve choice. And Ulrich tells us to look critically at whose choices we're protecting and who might be harmed because they're outside our focus. It forces us, or should force us, to actively seek out the perspectives of the marginalized, which, let's be honest, is pretty rare. It's hard to imagine a typical corporate board meeting where someone asks, okay, but how will this efficiency drive negatively impact our smallest suppliers who have no bargaining power? Or what about the future employees who will inherit the system?
Exactly. But that is the ethical obligation this framework presents. It's a much higher bar.
Okay, let's tackle what feels like the elephant in the room for many managers listening. This focus on minimizing harm, preserving choice, looking out for the marginalized. Isn't this just a recipe for paralysis? If we're constantly worried about the worst-case scenario, doesn't that just stifle innovation? Doesn't Minimax breed excessive caution and kill the risk-taking needed for progress?
That's probably the single biggest potential misunderstanding, yeah. And it's crucial to clarify this. The goal here is absolutely not to prevent change or stop progress. The goal is to create the conditions under which change and progress can happen without causing catastrophic, irreversible harm along the way. Remember the distinction we made earlier. Progress is about expanding capabilities, making things better, faster, whatever. Ethics is about preserving humanity, dignity, agency, the ability to recover. They aren't the same thing, but they absolutely have to support each other. One shouldn't destroy the other.
Okay, so how do they coexist? How does this framework allow for genuine innovation if it's so focused on harm avoidance?
Great question. To understand this, we need to bring in another idea from cybernetics, this time from Meguro Maruyama and his work on what's called second cybernetics. Maruyama made a key distinction between two fundamental types of feedback in systems. We all kind of know about negative feedback, right? That's the stabilizing force. It corrects deviations, keeps things on track, maintains equilibrium,
Right.
like a thermostat.
Keeps things stable.
But Maruyama focused heavily on the other kind, positive feedback. And positive feedback doesn't stabilize, it amplifies deviation. It takes a small change and makes it bigger. Now that sounds potentially dangerous, right? Runaway loops.
Yeah. Instability. Chaos.
It can be. But Maruyama pointed out that this deviation amplification is also the fundamental engine of morphogenesis. Morphogenesis basically means the creation of new forms, new structures, new orders. It's how systems evolve and innovate. So the crucial insight is, not every deviation from the norm is an error that needs to be stamped out by negative feedback. Some deviations are actually the seeds of something new and potentially better. They're the source of innovation.
Okay, I see where this is going. Applied to ethics. An ethical system design shouldn't try to eliminate all deviation, because if it did, it would also eliminate the possibility of innovation and learning.
Exactly. An ethical design, therefore, needs to create conditions where that positive deviation, the trying of new things, the necessary experience for growth can be generative, without spiraling into catastrophic, irreversible harm if the experiment doesn't work out.
So minimizing the maximum harm, Minimax, is therefore not the same as minimizing all deviation. That's the key.
Absolutely not. You're minimizing the potential negative consequences of deviation, especially the irreversible ones. But you're doing that precisely to maximize the potential for beneficial, positive deviation to occur safely.
Okay, could you give an example of how that works in practice?
Sure. Think about the difference between a really brittle system and one that's more, say, anti-fragile or resilient. A brittle system may be one that's been hyper-optimized for efficiency, stripped of all redundancy, leaving no room for choice, might suffer a total collapse from just a small, unexpected deviation. A single point of failure takes everything down.
Right, because there's no alternative path, no buffer.
Exactly. Now consider a system designed with Minimax principles in mind. It has built-in choice, it has reversibility, it has protected margins, maybe some redundancy. When a deviation occurs in this system, maybe someone tries a new approach and it fails locally, it doesn't cascade catastrophically. The failure is contained, it's observed. The existence of choice allows people to quickly adapt, maybe revert, try something else. And crucially, the learning from that failed deviation, the positive aspect of it, can be captured and amplified. The system learns and adapts. It gets stronger because it could handle the deviations safely.
Okay. So the Minimax principle, by demanding we preserve choice, von Forster, actually creates the safe space needed for Maruyama's positive deviation for innovation to happen without courting disaster.
That's the convergence. It's beautiful, really. If you expand choice, you create the conditions where experimentation is safer. And von Forster also added another layer. More freedom, more choice comes with more responsibility. Systems that expand choice inherently increase the responsibility of the people acting within them to consider the consequences.
So the ethical task isn't about eliminating risk. That's impossible and undesirable anyway if you want growth.
Right. It's about consciously managing risk. It's about nurturing diversity, allowing for experiments, fostering growth, while always protecting that fundamental condition of future choice. Protecting the ability to recover, adapt, and learn from whatever happens. You could say, designing ethically means creating and safeguarding the space where deviation, learning, and emergence can unfold without causing irreversible harm.
That's a really powerful reframe of the relationship between ethics and progress. Not enemies, but necessary partners, with ethics providing the safe container. Let's zoom in on one specific area where this plays out constantly, often tragically. You mentioned the invisible infrastructure earlier. Let's really unpack that, because I think this is where the drive for optimization causes so much hidden damage.
Agreed. This is critical.
So this invisible infrastructure, what exactly are we talking about? It's not the servers or the buildings.
No, not the physical stuff. It's the human glue. It's the relationships between people, between teams. It's the level of trust that exists. It's the informal knowledge, the stuff people know that isn't written down anywhere, the how things really get done around here. It's the tacit coordination, how people naturally adjust to each other's work without needing a formal process for every little thing. And it includes organizational memory, the history, the past lessons learned, often held collectively. It's all the stuff you can't easily measure or put on a spreadsheet.
The stuff that makes the org chart actually work.
Exactly. And the profound danger here is that this infrastructure is almost always taken for granted. It's invisible when it's working well. People only tend to notice it when it breaks down, when trust collapses, when communication fails, when knowledge walks out the door.
And the connection to optimization.
Well, in the relentless drive for efficiency, for standardization, for control, organizations consistently, often unintentionally, chip away at this very infrastructure. They try to replace messy, informal, resilient human ways of working with rigid, formal, mechanistic controls, because those are easier to measure and optimize. And in doing so, they systematically destroy the very foundations of the system's adaptability and resilience.
Can you give some examples of those destructive mechanisms?
Sure. Think about constant staff reductions or reorganizations that leave the remaining people stretched so incredibly thin. They literally have no time or energy left for informal chats, for mentoring, for helping colleagues outside their immediate tasks. The informal network just evaporates.
Right. Or implementing really restrictive communication policies.
Right.
Like banning informal chat tools and forcing everything through cumbersome official channels.
Exactly. You kill the quick problem-solving conversations that happen in the hallway or over a quick message. Or another big one, introducing highly siloed, individualistic, or competitive performance metrics. Things that actively discourage teams from collaborating or sharing knowledge because it might hurt their own numbers.
You're basically stripping away all the buffers, all the slack, all the social connective tissue.
Precisely. And trust. Trust is maybe the biggest casualty. Think about trust cybernetically for a moment. It acts like a super high-speed, high-bandwidth communication channel. When trust is high, people can coordinate quickly, share information freely, rely on each other, adapt on the fly.
Yeah, you don't need a contract and 3 levels of approval for every small interaction.
Exactly. And trust also acts as a critical system buffer. When the formal procedures inevitably fail or hit an edge case, and they always do, it's trust that allows people to quickly, informally figure out a workaround, coordinate, and solve the problem together.
But when that trust is gone, maybe due to layoffs, broken promises, unfair metrics,
then every single problem, no matter how tiny, has to grind through the slow, formal, bureaucratic channels. The system just seizes up, resilience vanishes, small problems become big problems, and harm starts to accumulate because the system can't adapt anymore. So these actions, the things done in the name of efficiency that destroy this invisible infrastructure, they are those quiet losses Ackoff warned about. And critically, they directly remove the choices, the optionality that the system needs to self-correct and survive.
So when we look at these efficiency drives, these restructuring efforts, we have to bring back that critical Minimax question, but frame it specifically around this invisible stuff. It's not just about the immediate financial gain. The real question becomes, the question is not what can be gained, but what can be lost without recovery.
That's the heart of it.
If that invisible infrastructure, the trust, the relationships, the informal knowledge gets destroyed,
Yeah.
Can it be easily rebuilt? Often the answer is no, or at least not quickly.
Exactly. Once trust is gone, rebuilding it is incredibly difficult and slow. If key knowledge walks out the door, it might be lost forever.
So if you lose that, the system loses its ability to heal itself. And you might be left with something that looks lean and optimized on paper, but is actually incredibly brittle, fragile.
A perfectly optimized shell, waiting to shatter at the first real shock. And that is the definition of inflicting maximum, potentially irreversible harm to the viability of the whole collective effort.
Wow. So true resilience, the ability to actually absorb shocks, adapt, keep functioning. It depends entirely on preserving the conditions that allow the system to self-heal.
Which means every time a manager considers a new policy, a new structure, a new efficiency target, they have to ask ethically, what choices are we taking away from people here? What informal buffers are we destroying? What communication pathways are we shutting down? And crucially, what possibilities for future recovery, for learning, for adaptation, are we foreclosing by eroding this invisible vital capital?
That's a heavy responsibility.
It is. Let's try to pull all these threads together now. We've talked about Minimax, about choice, about boundaries, about deviation, and about this invisible infrastructure. I think we've firmly established this key distinction between progress and ethics. They're related, but they are not the same thing. Progress is fundamentally about expanding capability, making things better, faster, cheaper, more powerful, whatever better means in context. Ethics, particularly this Minimax lens, is about the preservation of humanity within our systems. It's about protecting dignity, agency, well-being, and crucially, the potential for recovery.
And the danger, the managerial trap, lies in chasing progress as the only goal, letting the drive for expansion override the ethical constraints. Because progress without that ethical foundation, without the Minimax check, risks creating these incredibly efficient, optimized systems. But systems from which, if things go badly wrong, recovery might actually be impossible.
Yeah.
If we make a change irreversible, even if it looks good now, we've potentially created a trap. We've made the system fundamentally unsafe in the long run.
Precisely. But conversely, we also can't let ethics lead to paralysis. If we become so afraid of any potential harm that we resist all change, all adaptation, then we risk stagnation, irrelevance, and ultimately a different kind of system failure.
So we need both care and change.
We need both. And the beauty of the Minimax principle, especially when combined with von Forster and Maruyama, is that it holds both together. It provides the necessary ethical constraint for safe emergence. It demands action that actively reduces the maximum potential harm. That's the ethical floor, the foundation of care. But by focusing on preserving choice and allowing safe space for deviation, it simultaneously sustains the system's capacity for continued evolution, for learning, for positive change. That's the Maruyama von Forster imperative for openness.
So the job of management, viewed this way, it really shifts, doesn't it? It's not primarily about optimizing today's performance based on current metrics.
No, that's secondary. The primary task becomes sustaining the possibility of better futures. It's about designing and managing the system today in such a way that future evolution remains possible, remains viable. It means consciously avoiding actions that destroy the diversity, the variety, the range of choices from which those better futures might emerge. Protecting the seed corn, if you like.
Which loops us right back to Ackoff again, doesn't it? His idea that the future isn't just something out there to be predicted, it's something we actively design through our choices today.
Exactly.
And our ethical responsibility within that design process is profound. It's to ensure that the future remains open, that we don't, through our pursuit of short-term optimization, accidentally paint ourselves and those who come after us into an irreversible corner.
Beautifully put.
So if we were to summarize the core actions this framework calls for, it seems like three key things. 1, minimize the maximum potential harm, recognize the inherent fragility, especially of the human elements. 2, preserve and increase choice, keep options open, maintain reversibility, protect that possibility horizon. And 3, embrace positive deviation, safely create the conditions where learning, emergence, and innovation can happen without risking catastrophe.
That captures it perfectly. And if managers can internalize those three things, they start to realize that leadership isn't about achieving some kind of static perfection or absolute certainty. That's an illusion in complex systems anyway. It's really about maintaining this constant, delicate, dynamic balance between care for the present and openness to the future, between protection and change. And that balance is sustained only through intentional ethical design.
A continuous balancing act.
Always. And look, in the real world, in complex organizations with competing demands, compromises are often unavoidable. We know that. You probably can't protect every single person from every possible harm while also making necessary changes. But maybe the most humane path, the most ethically responsible path we can choose is to always prioritize protecting the conditions that allow us to begin again, to protect the system's ability to self-correct, to learn, to adapt, to protect optionality above all else, because that's what allows recovery.
Yeah. That feels like a really practical takeaway. Protect the ability to start over, or at least adapt significantly. So this whole deep dive into the Minimax principle, drawing on these powerful ideas from cybernetics, it really offers us, I think, a profound invitation. An invitation to fundamentally rethink how we approach pretty much every management decision. It invites you, listening now, to first, start asking fundamentally different questions in your own organizations. Questions that prioritize avoiding the worst losses before chasing the biggest gains. Second, it asks you to become acutely, uncomfortably aware of who loses when you design systems or draw boundaries, who is being marginalized. Third, it urges you to actively look for ways to increase the number of real choices available to people within the systems you influence, recognizing that optionality is resilience. And finally, It demands that you consciously work to preserve reversibility wherever possible and actively protect that fragile, vital, invisible infrastructure, the trust, the relationships, the informal knowledge that truly sustains collective work.
And underpinning all of that is a deep sense of responsibility. We are responsible, whether we acknowledge it or not, for the systems we create and sustain. We are responsible for the future possibilities we shut down through our actions and for the future possibilities we manage to keep open. Authentic management, maybe, when guided by this Minimax ethic, is about embracing that awesome responsibility. It's about striving constantly to minimize the harm we might inflict while simultaneously creating the conditions for genuine emergence, learning, and maybe even flourishing.
A powerful and demanding vision of leadership. This whole perspective, it's really built on these rich foundations of systems thinking and cybernetics, particularly as explored in Harish's work. If this has resonated with you, we strongly encourage you to explore more of his really insightful reflections. You can find them on his blog at harris'snotebook.wordpress.com. And as we mentioned, he's also an active member of the CyberSyn community. They're doing really important work in advancing these kinds of ideas. Definitely check them out if you're interested. That community is spelled CYB3-RSYN, CyberSyn. So keep exploring these ideas. Keep questioning the boundaries you encounter and the ones you draw yourself. And always remember that responsibility we have to try and keep the future open. Until next time on The Deep Dive.